I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
Oh, what a day! What a lovely day!
In case I don't see ya, good afternoon, good evening, and good night.
People keep telling me they know me. No one does.
But I do.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, people the world over, I'm Chris Gooch and I am back to do some more reviews. I've been on a really long hiatus from reviewing and I thought it'd be great to just slide back in with a nice and easy review. Oh shit, I'm reviewing Rise of the Skywalker. So anyway, the Emperor is back looking like the gatekeeper from the VHS board game Nightmare and seems to be attached to a machine similar to Kuzey's in Ghost in the Shell, and somehow survived Return of the Jedi and has been quietly building an absurd amount of Star Destroyers with Death Star weapons, so yeah. One of the key opening scenes in this film features Poe, Chewie and BB-8 light speed skipping through a mission, and to be honest, this opening scene is pretty much a metaphor for the entire film, as we essentially light speed skip from one scene to another as we search for MacGuffins inside other MacGuffins in order to reach the final MacGuffin. But at this point, it's ultimately very clear that this new trilogy did not have a roadmap or overall plan when it first began.
What are you doing there, 3PO?
Taking one last look, sir, at my friends.
So look, before we actually get into the review, I think it's always important to contextualize my relationship with Star Wars. I don't really love it or hate it. I was born a little after the first one, so it was not a life-changing experience in the cinema for me, as I watched the original series on VHS. I don't have rose-tinted glasses for the original trilogy, and I don't have a vendetta towards the saga. To me, they're just films like any other movie. I've always felt that Star Wars fans are a really interesting mob. They'll overlook things that they would genuinely criticize in other films, and then they'll contort themselves into knots to justify issues with Star Wars if people were to dare criticize it. On top of this, Star Wars fans can be the saga's biggest supporters, but also their biggest critics. Of course, for full acknowledgement, I never actually reviewed The Last Jedi when it first came out, and to be fair, that film was definitely divisive among Star Wars fans, so yet again, for pure context, before I actually review Rise of Skywalker, I'll just quickly summarise my thoughts on The Last Jedi. Now look, I wasn't actually a fan of The Last Jedi, but for completely different reasons to everyone else. I liked that it subverted people's expectations and took some real chances with the story, and I thought that it made some really ballsy choices as well. However, I wasn't a fan of the Force humour and several beats within the film that made Star Wars feel like every other generic Hollywood film. There were the shameless shirtless shots like the Marvel movies, and the comedy that just broke the tension that was being built up within scenes. Overall though, I was interested to see where the final installment would end up now that it had painted itself into a corner. Anyway, let's begin the actual review. So, as mentioned before, after painting the series into a corner due to the death of Snoke and the death of Luke Skywalker, Abrams and Batman vs Superman screenwriter Chris Terrio opted for returning to the well, bringing back the Emperor and a threat that is almost comical in nature with a ridiculous claim of being behind it all, despite none of the previous films hinting at this, and even more ridiculous is the thousands of Star Destroyers rising up from under the ground. Rey and the gang have to find and destroy the Emperor before it's too late, and this leads to one side mission to another in order to reach the endgame. There are some big moments with some major consequences that are then completely undercut in the very next scene. But you know what? Let's actually just stop for a moment and focus on the positives. The film itself looks great. From the set design, costumes and special effects, there isn't a single inch of frame that is wasted throughout the entire film. Adam Driver and Daisy Ridley are the heart and driving force of this series, with Driver having created one of the most complex and interesting villains in cinema for quite some time. He really has carried this new series in many ways. The scenes with Carrie Fisher have been integrated as well as possibly could have been. This has not been an enviable task by no doubt, but it does work to some extent. It might be a little bit jarring and a lot of the other characters interacting with her have to do a lot of heavy lifting. But without delving too deep into spoilers though, they closed off her arc as well as they could have considering the circumstances. The battles in the first two acts are really impressive and well executed, and this really goes hand in hand with how not a single inch of footage has been wasted throughout the film. But look, outside of this, the film as a whole doesn't really make much sense, relies too heavily on many of the beats of Return of the Jedi, much like The Force Awakens relied too heavily on A New Hope, and it really does feel like J.J. Abrams has just xeroxed one of Lucas's old scripts for Jedi and played mix and match with a bunch of new characters. Now honestly, look, I can't talk anymore without getting into spoilers, so if you haven't watched the film, please skip to the timecode shown on the screen to hear my final summary. Oh yeah, and please excuse any swears if you've got any sensitive ears. Let's start with the killing of f***ing Chewie, only to reveal that he was on another ship that we never actually saw. Follow this up with the erasing of C-3PO's memory, only to have it reinstalled via backup a few scenes later. Then we get a really interesting moment with Hux being a spy, only to be killed in the very next scene rather than actually exploring how interesting that could have been, with a cat and mouse game playing out within the First Order. And then of course there's the stabbing of Kylo Ren, which made for what could have been a really interesting third act, but instead he gets force healed and almost negates the whole death of Princess Leia in the first place. Then of course there's the killing of the Emperor, leading to everyone else automatically dying like destroying a Chitauri mothership. It's all just very much MCU with its fake outs and lack of real consequences, along with the easy fixes. Of course, the final act is quite literally pulled straight from Jedi, with the Emperor revealing the big Star Destroyer battle to the final Jedi as he tries to goad them into killing him so he can become even more powerful. There's the whole horses in space trying to take out a communication tower on the Star Destroyer because, you know, having Ewoks taking out another communication tower on Endor would have maybe been a little bit too on the nose for people. But ultimately, as I've said, look, so many Star Wars fans will twist themselves into knots to explain how every single aspect that I've just complained about makes perfect sense and is part of just some amazing master plan that us, noobs would never fully understand, but I'm willing to accept that. But ultimately, I think if this was any other film, I think everyone else would look at it and just go, this just doesn't sound, feel, or look right. Overall though, Last Jedi, love it or hate it, painted us into a corner that could have led to a really interesting final act, but instead, fearing fanboy wrath, they decided to play it safe and play it familiar, and still not be able to please everybody. But of course, as a non-Star Wars fan, I always try and put myself in the shoes of Star Wars fans, and then realize that I don't think even Star Wars fans know what they really want. I'm young enough to remember when people hated Return of the Jedi, but when the prequels came out, they came to love Jedi. Then this new Disney trilogy began, and everyone developed a newfound respect for the prequels. Well, some did. Sometimes I just take a step back and wonder, was the first two Star Wars films just a fluke? Because they seem to be the only ones that people can universally agree upon. With the Skywalker saga coming to an end, well, depending on how you view that final scene, maybe it's time to take another break from these tales in a galaxy far away, regroup and start anew instead of rehashing nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. Star Wars Episode 9 Rise of Skywalker, despite all these complaints, gets 3 out of 5 stars, or, lightsabers or Wookiees or whatever else you want to use as your unit of measurement.
The Force will be with you.